Okay, welcome everybody to this session, Citywide Inclusive Sanitation as a public service. I have a great team with me to discuss this particular topic. My name is Yvonne Magawa from the Eastern and Southern Africa Water and Sanitation Regulators Association. Supporting me is Sam Drabo from MUSIP, Guy Norman, Oliver Jones, Punita, Nook Naidu, Richard Cheriot, Jacques Zitonda, Muyunda Abdul Malik, and Alice Shrekongost. Thank you. Our session is going to run as follows. We'll have an overview from myself. We will discuss responsibility or have a presentation on responsibility from Sam. Then we'll look at accountability, then resource planning and management by Oliver. Then we'll go into a panel discussion and we'll end with some closing remarks. So I'd like to invite all of you to place any questions you may have in the Pathway platform, and we will be able to address these questions as we go and also discuss them when we get to the panel discussion. Okay, so we're looking at the Citywide Inclusive Sanitation framework. And when we talk of good, what does good look like? So the CWIS framework aims to achieve 3 service outcomes, which are equity, safety, and sustainability. But in order to achieve these, it needs to have certain system functions. And this is what we are saying, responsibility. An authority or authorities must have a clear mandate for ensuring inclusive, safe, and sanitation services. There must be accountability. If there is an authority that is mandated, where is the accountability and who are they accountable to? So therefore, under accountability, we look at performance being transparently monitored and managed with positive or negative incentives. But in order for the mandated authority to be able to discharge its responsibility and be held accountable, we recognize that these authorities must also be resourced. So we look at the issue of resource management and planning. So resources are, there to support implementation of the mandate and achieve goals across time and space. Next. So in looking at what we've, thank you. So we are saying until non-steward sanitation is treated as a public service, including in informal settlements, we will not achieve citywide inclusive sanitation. So as in your city, what is the mandated sanitation authority? Who actually is legally responsible for providing the service? At the same time, we also want you to think about what performance accountability mechanism is in place. To whom are these mandated authorities reporting, or to whom are they accountable? And what sort of accountability mechanisms exist? Then in your same city, what financing framework can it reference when seeking public CapEx finance? Are these authorities well-resourced? How is planning done? So as we go through the various topics and our presenters are giving us background, we would like you to reflect on these. And when we come to the panel discussions, we'll probably be able to hear from you and what exists in your city. It actually came from extensive research of a number of countries, but we'll only be able to present 1 or 2 examples as we go along. But there are wider papers that address these issues. There are some short form papers which have already been produced and detailed papers which will be launched in the next few weeks. So at this stage, I will invite Sam to be able to take us through what responsibilities mean for CWIS. Sam, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Yvonne, for that introduction. So I'm going to give a rapid tour of key findings from the responsibilities paper. Next. So this paper was co-authored Jacques Nsonda and Myunda Abdu-Maliki from RURA, the regulator in Rwanda, and the Ministry of Water and Environment in Uganda. You'll be hearing from both Jacques and Abdu-Maliki in the panel discussion. So this was a global mapping of over 30 countries to understand which authorities have the legal mandate for urban sanitation service provision, and critically what is included in that mandate. And I wanted to give a big shout out here to consultant Kathy Eels, who led that initial mapping and did a fantastic job. So building on that, we conducted key informant interviews with experts within city authorities, regulators, ministries. So the findings we're about to present are a synthesis essentially of the perspectives of those experts, those decision makers who are dealing with these issues every day in their context. In terms of the structuring questions, I just wanted to emphasize that we were interested in positive traits that can be identified to inform the design of urban sanitation mandates, and also how are mandated actors executing their responsibilities, which is a huge topic in itself, taking into account the service model, business model, how are services being delivered. Next. So in conducting this initial mapping, we then distilled the findings into what might be seen as 5 broad mandate structures. So there are 5 ways in which mandates for urban sanitation tend to be structured at the global level. The point to emphasize here is the distinction between what we term integrated responsibilities, that is where mandates for sewage sanitation and non-sewage sanitation sit with the same authority, and split responsibilities, that is where different authorities are responsible for sewage and non-sewage sanitation respectively. So in the paper, we include 5 case studies where we look at each of these structures in turn and the implications and how services are being approached under those structures. Those are Malaysia, Zambia, Uganda, Dhaka specifically in Bangladesh, and Mozambique. Next. And we also in the paper map responsibilities across the sanitation service chain in each of those locations, as well as looking more broadly, presenting the findings of the mapping at the global level. Next. So if you take one message away from the responsibilities paper, it is this: responsibilities are not static. They are and can be revised. And we're seeing this in multiple countries. We're seeing examples where countries are driving significant process, where they are actively reviewing, reforming, rationalizing institutional responsibilities for urban sanitation. So where responsibilities are currently unclear or not fit for purpose, they can be improved. We detail a number of examples in the paper. You see here Zambia, Tanzania, Rwanda, Bangladesh, a number of countries where this work is taking place at the policy level, frameworks, or working to ensure increased compliance with existing legal mandates for urban sanitation. Next. Okay, so I want to take us through now 4 what we call positive traits for mandates for urban sanitation. So points to bear in mind for policymakers, for decision makers in the design of mandates. First of all, mandates must provide clarity on who is responsible for ensuring different elements of the sanitation service chain. Now, historically, mandates for non-sewage sanitation in particular have been poorly delineated, but there has been somewhat of a shift in the SDG era. Policies formulated more recently are more likely to address the full service chain. And we note the service chain boundaries require particular attention. One example here is household responsibility for containment and institutional responsibility for emptying. Where do those respective responsibilities begin and end? That needs to be really clear. Next. Secondly, formal legal mandates and actual de facto practice must be aligned. We see examples where local government, for example, may have the mandate for emptying, hand this over to utility, but without clear definition of where responsibility lies. Alternatively, responsibility may be unclear at one specific element of the sanitation chain. There might be a discrepancy between who is responsible for that element on paper and in practice. So ideally, there should be alignment there, or where there isn't, service provision must be formally delegated. Next. Now, this was a really striking finding. What was striking was the level of consensus on this point among the experts, the decision makers that we spoke to across contexts. Responsibilities for sewage and non-sewage sanitation should be integrated where feasible. But again, that caveat is really important. Context does matter. But we do see growing support among public officials for assigning responsibility to a single authority, specifically the utility where there is one. We're seeing notably a shift in Eastern and Southern Africa towards placing responsibility for both sewage sanitation and non-sewage sanitation with the utility. We're seeing this in Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya to an extent, Rwanda to an extent. And this approach has been recommended in the African Sanitation Policy Guidelines, again, duly caveated where feasible, and in the CWIS framework for inclusive urban sanitation service provision. In the paper, we detail at some length the arguments in favor of this approach, which we don't have time to go into today, but do encourage you to read that in the paper. Next. Finally, in terms of design, we wanted to focus in on this point around serving the poorest, which is clearly absolutely fundamental to citywide inclusive sanitation. The service jurisdiction of mandates must include informal settlements. This begins at the constitutional level. So clear responsibilities for serving the poorest should ideally be enshrined in the constitution. We see this in Kenya, where there is a human right to sanitation in the constitution, and where that is the case, that has a number of positive knock-on impacts. At the city level, the definition of city boundaries is key to inclusive mandates. And we also talk about a number of mechanisms to support services to the poorest, including, for example, connecting sanitation to wider urban development. We're not talking here only about sanitation in informal settlements, but practically combining sanitation with other basic services as part of integrated slum upgrading. That can really increase the impact of sanitation activities. And also creating incentives for the private sector to engage with informal settlements and to serve low-income customers specifically. We give some examples of that, and we emphasize the requirement for explicit tracking of services to the poor. Next. So I wanted to close just with two wider points around execution. First of all, we're talking here about clear responsibilities in terms of the authority who has responsibility for urban sanitation, but that does not mean necessarily that full public sector service provision. The private sector has a really critically important role to play, where policies, where responsibilities are being revised in countries. We are seeing that the role of the private sector is being given consideration, the role in supporting the responsible authority to execute. We're seeing the progressive formalization, again, a long way to go, but we are seeing progress in a number of locations. We're seeing vacuum tank operators, informal emptiers being brought into the fold, raising standards, creation of standard operating procedures. Next. And finally, to emphasize the need for enhanced focus on the institutional mechanism for sanitation service delivery. So we've been talking here about clarity of roles essentially outside the institution, which authority is responsible, but we also need clarity of roles within responsible authorities. A really interesting example here is Lusaka Water, where an FSM unit has been created to support the utility in the delivery of its mandate for non-sewage sanitation. So there needs to be consideration around how services will be delivered within institutions. The execution of revised mandates, for example, utilities adopting a mandate for non-sewage sanitation, is a long-term process of adjustment, institutional reform, and that needs continued engagement, support to those authorities from line ministries, regulators, even from IFIs, ensuring that the space is built in to the design of loans for that institutional reform process. Next. Okay, so I've covered a lot of ground quickly there, but the bottom line, clear responsibilities are the foundation for CWIS. Countries are taking active steps to review, reform, rationalize responsibilities for urban sanitation. Next. And in the paper, we provide what might be seen as a checklist for policymakers, for decision makers involved in the design of mandates. And we also share reflections on execution. And just on that latter point, accountability here is clearly fundamental. There needs to be upwards and downwards accountability. That came out very strongly from the research. Financing is clearly also fundamental, but I haven't talked about those because Guy and Oliver are now going to address those in turn. Okay, thanks for that. Back to you, Yvonne.
Thank you so much, Sam, for that good overview of what responsibility looks like. As you started, responsibility is not static, and countries are making efforts to review this and align it to ensure that de facto and de jure practice align. So now, when you have a legally mandated service provider, we recognize that in some cases, not every provider is actually legally mandated, but we are talking of legally mandated service providers. What does then accountability look like? Guy, over to you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Guy Norman. I am with a company called Urban Research. I'm going to talk very briefly about accountability. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. This essentially looked at similar countries to the countries that Sam looked at under responsibilities, involving key informant interviews with multiple experts, structuring questions. What are current approaches for ensuring accountability, and particularly with reference to non-sewered sanitation? How do appropriate approaches for accountability vary depending on the institutional structure? And what are ways forward? Next slide, please. Let's start by asking what exactly is accountability. So in our definition, we have defined accountability as centrally requiring three things: that the mandated service provision entity has clear and appropriate performance objectives. Secondly, that mechanisms are in place to ensure rigorous monitoring of performance. Again, tracking outcomes, monitoring outcomes translate into consequences, which may be positive rewards or negative penalties for mandated entities. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. What then are mechanisms of accountability? Let me run through this list. We may see independent regulation, where we have one regulator and multiple service providers, often utilities, and examples of that, as is well known, are Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, etc. Secondly, we may have independent regulation, but with just one national service provider. An independent regulator, one national service provider is in fact uncommon, though Malaysia is an example of this. We may have ministerial regulation, no independent regulator, and this is often seen in countries with a single national service provider, such as Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire. We may also see self-regulation. Now, self-regulation certainly can often be not regulation, but where it is strong, our finding, our opinion at least, is that it can be very powerful. And Johannesburg in South Africa is a good example of that. City ranking schemes, as we see in India, for example, can provide a mechanism for accountability. Customer complaint mechanisms, which of course are only valid if you're a customer, and wider citizen complaint mechanisms. And finally, electoral accountability. If you're a municipality and you're not providing good services, in theory, you can be voted out, in theory. Next slide, please. Very briefly, our central finding from this part of the study around accountability is that we see some progress towards increased accountability for non-sewered sanitation and sanitation for the poor. I'll give you some examples. This includes the introduction of poor-specific indicators specific to low-income communities by Kenya's regulator WASREP. In Zambia, we see the ongoing integration of desludging operators, FSM operators, into the formal regulatory framework. And as already mentioned, in some cases, we see instances of very rigorous self-regulation. But in general, and there is no getting around this, in general, accountability for non-sewered sanitation remains weak and embryonic, so that our primary conclusions from this piece of the work are around recommendations for moving forward. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. Firstly, accountability for non-sewered sanitation and for services for the poor needs to be a central focus. There has been some progress, but in general, governments and service providers are held accountable for sewered sanitation, but not for non-sewered sanitation. And this must change. Number two, next one, please, Elizabeth. merely enabling the private sector is unlikely to be sufficient for accountability. We see that some countries are starting to bring non-sewered sanitation under regulation, but often this is a private sector enabling model, not true contracting. And in our view, true inclusion and true accountability probably requires public contracting of services. Next slide, please. Number 3, accountability for non-sewered sanitation needs to pay strong attention to containment. And there are close links between the service provider's responsibility for desludging and household responsibilities for containment and desludging. These links are complex, and if we want citywide inclusive sanitation, containment and desludging cannot be considered solely a household responsibility. Next slide, please. Number 4, strengthening transparency is really fundamental for accountability, and it's a relatively easy win. This can work, regardless of the institutional structure. It's widely applicable in pretty much any country. Things could be improved by collecting and transparently publishing detailed data on sanitation service levels. Next slide, please. Last one. Demand should be viewed as central. Now, when we talk about demand, we often understand economic demand, willingness to pay. But what we're saying here is more fundamental. In order for citywide inclusive sanitation to happen, people living in low-income settlements need to expect sanitation and demand sanitation as a public service. Next slide, please. So to conclude, within my 8 minutes, in a number of countries, that includes Zambia and Kenya, also other countries, please do consult the publications. We see very positive progress towards improving accountability for non-sewered sanitation and services for the poor, but it's very, very early days. Much more is needed to advance accountability so that low-income urban dwellers receive a publicly managed, a publicly organized sanitation services in the same way that less poor urban dwellers typically benefit from a publicly managed sewerage service. And finally, as I've already said, increased transparency, better data collection, transparent and accessible publication. It's a relatively easy win, and it's applicable in all contexts, regardless of whether there's an independent regulator or no regulator, ministerial regulation. Transparency is an easy win. If I can just close by mentioning another session which is coming up tomorrow, which is very closely related to what I've talked about. This session is at 2 o'clock, tomorrow the 26th. It's called Promoting Rights to Water and Sanitation, Key Role of Regulators. And I really encourage anybody who's interested in this to see that session. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Guy. Having outlined that we need clear responsibilities, we need strong accountability, but all this needs to be supported by good resource planning and management. So Oliver, please take us through.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and good morning, everybody. I'm Oliver Jones from Blue Chain Consulting, and along with Angela Kimani of WASREP, we've undertaken the review of the resource planning and management function for citywide inclusive sanitation. Next slide, please. The analysis was based around the elements of a financing framework that could support improvements in resource planning and management for urban sanitation services. As you can see, financing frameworks are not a single document, but made up of a range of rules, policies, tools, and systems. This slide sets out some of the key components that are required for an effective framework, covering assessments and diagnostics, strategy and monitoring. And in addition, it includes the outcomes of citywide inclusive sanitation investments which they would hope to achieve. The next slide, please. The analysis, similar to the other studies, was based around interviews with stakeholders in 6 countries and from a range of institutions, regulators, utilities, local and national government, and donors. And evidence was also drawn from a number of other countries, including Cambodia, India, and the Philippines. This table sets out country status against a number of indicators to show the progress of each country towards having a comprehensive and effective financing framework in place for urban sanitation. The reports, as mentioned before, and the long form report that will be released in September sets out the country experiences and statuses in more detail. But today I'm going to focus on the higher level findings. Next slide, please. So firstly, it's clear that financing frameworks are key to prioritizing public finance for inclusive sanitation outcomes. Respondents believed that financing frameworks need to be guided from the top down through national targets and strategies, as well as principles and modalities. But they also need to be influenced from the bottom up through local plans and taking local capacity into account, as well as listening to the needs and voices of the poor and the unserved. Effective investment planning also requires a detailed understanding of service needs of different groups and the costs of different options related to initial capital expenditure and, of course, ongoing operational expenditure to keep services running. But this data is often lacking, especially for non-sewage sanitation services across the supply chain, and also for soft infrastructure, as I'll come on to a bit later. The CWIS service assessment planning tool has been designed in collaboration with regulators, service providers to assist in evaluating a variety of options and prioritizing the most cost-effective to expand sanitation services. And if you're not familiar with that, I advise having a look at it. I think there's been some sessions on it already this week. But it's clear that effective investment plans should provide a clear criteria for the allocation of resources across a range of competing options and constituents, as well as provide transparency for investment decisions made in the future. Next slide, please. However, a significant challenge the sector faces is that financing and investment decisions, asset ownership, and operations, as seen in this diagram, often sit with different stakeholders. These stakeholders have different priorities and visions for how infrastructure and services should be delivered. And confusion over institutional roles, split sanitation mandates between SUAD and non-SUAD, as Sam was talking about, and weak fiscal decentralization have proven to compound this issue. As a result, performance goals and incentives for different institutions often don't align. And this can have a significant impact on how resources are raised, allocated, and spent. And down the line, this also hampers efforts to hold financially disempowered institutions to account for spending decisions and investment results. Next slide, please. Achieving the right balance of finance is critical to the long-term expansion of services, as well as equity and viability of results. We're pretty clear from the discussions we've had that tariffs remain an important component of the financing mix. However, customer affordability and weak revenue collection impacts service authorities' abilities to achieve full cost recovery. Split mandates have proven to hamper cross subsidies of tariffs, especially if authorities are new to non-sewage service provision, which can be particularly challenging to collect revenue from. It's also clear that taxes need to be a larger share of the financing mix going forward, but they also need to be used more strategically to address inequality and to stimulate other investments. Guy touched on the private sector. And while commercial finance presents an opportunity to increase investment, it remains out of reach for most cities. And realistically, it's unlikely to be targeted at the poorest communities. Next slide, please. Where the investment is allocated also needs to be reviewed, with a greater emphasis placed on supporting national soft systems infrastructure alongside new hard infrastructure. So this means for service authorities, investment needs to be channeled to strengthen customer service, billing, and asset management systems. And where new non-SUAD mandates have been taken on, resources are also needed to support institutions to adapt to their new role through capacity development and building new relationships. At the national level, investments needed is required for regulators, infrastructure development departments, and monitoring systems to increase accountability, as Guy has touched on, and transparency around investments. In our view, and the view from those we spoke to, governments and donors should allocate resources to support this transition that's needed to citywide inclusive sanitation. And this could include temporary subsidies to support the improved efficiency of both the public and the private sector. Next slide, please. So finally, and really important, and Guy touched on this as well, the tracking and investment results is imperative, but it's currently overlooked by both lenders and borrowers. More and better data is needed to improve performance and drive future investments. But output and investment data is often not captured, and where it is captured, it's difficult to align to undertake effective analysis. This is something that TrackFin's been trying to address, and other tools as well. But in most countries, it's not yet been implemented extensively at the municipality level or for the broad range of sanitation services. As a result, planned versus actual results are often not scrutinized with expenditure data, and failure isn't understood. Tracking how investments have addressed rather than reinforced inequality in access is currently also not effectively done in most cities. Furthermore, capturing medium-term outcomes, such as whether investments result in service being expanded or improved or sustained over time, also needs to be prioritized. Tools have been developed to support the segmentation of service providers by performance and creditworthiness, and such approaches offer an opportunity to more effectively and efficiently allocate resources to support providers at different levels of maturity. It's worth looking at the World Bank's utility for finance tools if you're not familiar with them. But finally, I think my final point here is that investment planning would also benefit from having a learning orientation to ensure that the right incentives are in place to accommodate and learn from failure as citywide inclusive sanitation approaches are more widely adopted. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Oliver, for that intensive overview of what resource planning should look like and what needs to be considered. To dissect the three areas or the three functions of responsibilities, accountability and resource planning and management, I will invite our panelists. Punita, we have very strong panelists with regulatory background. Punita is from Malaysia, and she used to be part of the regulator in Malaysia. We have Jacques, who is actually coming from Rwanda, where there is an independent regulator with one national service provider, but private sector is in charge of non-sewer sanitation. We have Abdul Malik, who's coming from ministerial regulator, which is under ministry, and a national utility, but also several other provincial utilities. And Richard Cheriot from Kenya, WASREP, where WASREP is an independent regulator and with several national utilities, several provincial utilities. So I'll begin with Jacques. In terms of responsibilities, the need for clear responsibilities from your context, what does it look like in terms of having clarity in responsibilities, and what do you think can be done to strengthen that? Jacques.
Thank you, Yvonne. Yes, for the case of Rwanda, I'm going to discuss, of course, the case of Rwanda. In Rwanda, we currently have a situation where there is a lack of clarity and responsibilities for urban sanitation, specifically for non-sewer sanitation. And this lack has proved that without clear institutional mandates, it's impossible to achieve clear or sustainable urban sanitation. We have a sanitation policy dated 2016, However, the policy, of course, is being updated to handle responsibility issues and accommodate new thinking. Despite that we have this dedicated sanitation policy, some of the reasons that we could not achieve sustainable sanitation, urban sanitation services, are also linked with the poor, a policy that could not cover everything. And this was mainly because it does not clearly define responsibilities, especially for non-sewer sanitation, and provide clear mandate to institutions. Some mandates are shared among stakeholders, and this creates overlap, duplication, and lack of action and accountability, as well as the absence of resource mobilization, planning, and management. For example, the policy of 2016 provides split mandates whereby the local government or municipalities have a mandate to non-sewer sanitation. It also comes where the emptying, transportation, treatment of fecal sludge can be provided by utilities or the private sector. So this creates a kind of duplication and overlaps. And in terms of, for example, accountability, it does not clearly show who's supposed to do what. Again, the national utility and other commercial operators, that's the policy, shall provide or shall cover operational costs for urban wastewater treatment services by user fees. Another example shows that districts here who are municipalities shall implement their own sanitation service for on-site sanitation within the territories. So this shows that the policy did not clearly show who is supposed to do what. So the mix-up has an implication, of course, on sector financing and investment, and at the end on service delivery. So for us to be able to address some of these challenges, where the regulator has initiated the development of guidelines for fecal sludge management, because we don't have a sewerage system, and with the exception of a small decentralized networks in few modern estates, so we mainly rely on non-sewer sanitation. So the guidelines, we therefore provide a guidance that will ensure safe and sustainable service delivery across the sanitation value chain, capture, containment, emptying, transportation, treatment, disposal, and reuse, as well as providing a framework for monitoring and evaluation in different ways. One is by defining and clarifying stakeholders' role and responsibilities that were not clearly highlighted in the policy. Here, we've opted for the utility to take the responsibility for the whole non-sewer sanitation value chain, but can delegate some functions to the private sector. Of course, remember that delegation does not release responsibility functions. So the private sector, we mainly deal with emptying and transportation, but the responsibility of the utility will remain. The guidelines also define and provide alternatives for business models across the sanitation value chain and set alternatives for financing mechanisms. They also clarify licensing across sanitation value chain for construction of containment treatment facilities, emptying, operation and maintenance for treatment plants, as well as valorization and reuse. They will provide as well the monitoring and evaluation and set key performance indicators to be monitored and reported. So the National Public Utility, of course, recognizes this role but is very much reluctant to take responsibility without a clear defined legal mandate. More specifically, to avoid accountability issues within a context of lack of resources currently on non-sewer sanitation.
Thank you,
We are also trying to update the regulation and ensure that the regulation, in most cases, guidelines and policies do not provide any enforcement powers. And this does not, of course, when it comes to regulators, we mainly check if there is no, if the service is not well provided, and then sanctions should be also come in. So we are in the process of drafting new regulation and updating existing ones, specifically for enforcement function. We are also trying to see to push the sanitation law that is in pipeline so that it can provide a clear mandate. Sanitation was left for so long to the private sector, especially in capture and containment construction, desludging. But I believe that it is a public good that the government is attentively responsible for and cannot be left entirely to the private sector. This is because it is meant to protect public health and environment. However, of course, a strong partnership is recommended between the private sector and the public sector, especially for the construction and emptying transportation. I don't know if I managed to.
Yes, thank you so much, Chuck. You have done a very good illustration of how the three functions actually fit in together. And you illustrate a very interesting scenario of coming from private sector, but still insisting that government needs to be involved. Whereas in a number of countries, it is usually the opposite, where government is the one in charge or the municipalities and advocating for the private to be involved. Coming to you, Abdul Malik, Uganda. We understand that there are two institutions responsible for sanitation. We have the local authority in charge of non-sewer, whereas the national utility is in charge of sewer sanitation. Now, what does that mean for aligning the responsibilities of these two entities from your context?
Well, I must also add that clear responsibility is key. Responsibility to everyone is ideally no responsibility in this case. When it comes to sewer sanitation, it's a bit clear, and this is done by a national utility. But the national utility has kind of a scope of where their operations should end, and usually do not extend beyond certain areas. When it comes to non-sewer sanitation, here, again, there is some bit of working relation between local governments and the national utility in terms of treatment of fecal sludge. The national utility ideally also manages the treatment plants. So local governments dispose fecal sludge at those fecal sludge treatment plants, and that is managed by the national utility. However, the national utility is only responsible for treating. Now, who should be responsible for actually transporting? Who should be responsible for ensuring that facilities are emptied at regular intervals? Now, this is where we need to actually bring the two together and try to align the responsibilities, clearly showing that local governments will be responsible for this. This is what the private sector should be doing in terms of non-sewer sanitation. The plan at the moment is now to come up with tools and instruments that now helps us to kind of consolidate the planning for the national utility and at the same time for the local governments in that context. So we've had a number of tools in place that we are piloting at the moment. The SAP tool being one of them, but ideally we had the town sanitation planning tool. The idea is to try and map out and see who should be responsible for what. And now working with the national utility and local governments, how do we ensure that each of these slightly getting to now accountability, who of these should be held accountable for non-sewered sanitation and sewered sanitation in that context. So going forward, we bringing these different players together in light of trying to clarify on responsibilities for containment, or who is responsible for emptying and who should be responsible for emptying in that context. Yvonne, in the interest of time, I will submit, but should there be any other things to clarify, I'm around.
Thank you so much for that. Indeed, when you look across the entire sanitation chain, it is important to really clarify who is responsible for which segment of the chain in order for everything to work together. But that brings us now to questions of who is accountable at the same time across the chain. Richard, coming from Kenya, what do you think can be done to improve accountability mechanisms? Mira says that a regulator must also have good monitoring mechanisms in order for there to be strong accountability, including government itself. What is your take?
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and welcome everyone to this discussion. I think listening to the three presentations by the other three presenters, I think it's very clear that it's very difficult to have a clear line between responsibilities, accountability, and resource allocation. I think for me, and speaking for Kenya, for example, there's definitely need because you're talking about accountability in the context of that performance of the people really delivering this service is clearly managed and monitored. And like you rightfully said, we can't clearly monitor performance unless we have clearly outlined really who should be delivering that service. So I think for me, the starting point is a clear outline in terms of responsibilities. And looking at the Kenyan context very closely, I think we have, borrowing from what we have done for seaward sanitation, looking at the case of the water utilities, I think if we have a clear definition and have a clear accountability mechanism, then it becomes very clear in terms of how we should really be able to push accountability with respect to non-seaward sanitation. So I think the starting point for me is a clear policy framework that clearly outlines who should be delivering this service. We know definitely, of course, listening to the three presentations, that for non-seaward sanitation, we have a very big role that the private sector is playing. How do we then ensure that currently, and like outlined in most of the countries, that we bring these players under some form of accountability mechanism for them really to be able to for us really to be able to track how they are doing with respect to improvement of service provision. So I think for me, I would start from a clear policy framework, and I'm happy, I think the presenters mentioned about, in the case of Kenya, we have even anchored this in the highest form of the legal framework, which is the Constitution. So the Constitution has rightfully said that we have that right to water and sanitation services. So the issue then is how do we actualize that right for the citizens? And I think having now borrowing from that and having a clear policy framework that clearly outlines then who is responsible for delivery of that service. Even in cases like Jack mentioned, where this service provision has been delegated, then we delegate, but responsibility still rests with the actor that has that mandate. And of course, also linked to the issue of policy, looking at currently the institutional framework in our country, and looking at more closely in the case of CWIS sanitation, we realize that the water service providers, or utilities as they are called, have accountable to different actors, depending on what actions really we are looking at. If it's for issues of policy, then it is the responsibility in our case for the that responsibility rests with the national government and devolved units, which we call county governments in our case. And so it is the responsibility of these actors to ensure that they provide an enabling environment, enabling policy framework for the actors really to be able to deliver that service. Of course, we have, in the case of Kenya, of course, we have independent regulation. So like you've rightfully said, regulators basically implement policy and track the implementation of that policy. So we, for example, should be telling government, this is how we are doing with respect to access to sanitation services. And really to be able to do that, then like we say, we also must have a clear policy framework. We must also be able from our end really to have systems to be able to really monitor what is happening with respect to access to sanitation services. But of course, again, the other key factor in terms of pushing accountability mechanisms is really the public support that we can get if really the public have quite aware in terms of their rights. So if we have a transparent system of really putting out information out there, then I think public support in terms of pushing the different actors really to be able to do what they are supposed to do would really improve on accountability mechanism. So really in terms of how much each of these actors can really do is determined also by the extent to which they can be able to sanction for positive or negative performance. And I think having a clear mechanism of really rewarding or sanctioning performance is another key aspect in terms of driving accountability mechanism. I think to close on this, as presented by Oliver, we talk of basically if you have functions, then resources should really follow functions. And I think we can't really talk of an effective accountability mechanism without really talking about the issue of provision of resources. And so I think looking at the Kenyan context, we know definitely that, and looking at the national targets, resources that are available are not adequate. So I quite agree with the issue of having in place a system for proper investment planning, because we're talking about increasing the amount of resources that are available for improving access to sanitation services. But again, with the resources that are inadequate, we really need to optimize the same. And for us to be able to really optimize the same, we must put in place an effective investment planning framework. And so I think these are key issues for me. We can't exactly divorce these different dimensions from each other, and to really have an effective accountability mechanism, then we need to have a clear institutional framework and a clear framework for provision of resources to the different actors that provide these services. Thank you very much, Yvonne.
Thank you very much, Richard. Drawing from your last point, Bonita, when it comes to resource planning and management, often policy does indicate how the service providers are to be resourced. And this is often not practical or not demonstrated practically in terms of budget allocations and what actually ends up as investments into service provision. What is your take on having good resource planning frameworks and what it means when there are no investment plans by utilities or business plans by utilities, and how that impacts resource planning and management. Bonita.
Thank you, Yvonne. I think listening to the presenters and what has been explained by a couple of panelists here, I think without a doubt, responsibility and accountability is a key thing that requires the proper institutional arrangement. Because what we can see is the way resources are being planned, especially if it's actually if it's financing from external agencies, what happens is the financing goes through national government, but the spending is actually happens at the local government. So how does that being linked up? The expectation of the national government who's actually taking up the loans or the financing, but spending it on the local government, what are their capabilities or limitation in actually delivering it? I think that is the first key component. Second aspect of it is we have to understand when it comes to sanitation needs, what are the intention of providing the sanitation needs? If you look at the CWIS agenda, it gives a very clear picture of what should be focused on and what should never be left out. So that should give a guiding picture of harnessing or leveraging cross-sectoral policies that is available in that country or in the city. For instance, what are the policies available to design smart cities, or policies available to address hardcore poor, human rights, policies on housings? I think those are the things that need to be leveraged on. If really relying solely on sanitation works per se to achieve the financing or resource needed for the works in that particular city or country, it will cause a lot of limitation. So that cross-sectoral component is super essential. And I also would like to address one more point is about how to differentiate between a regulatory role and operating role, service provider's role. Whether they are two different entities or a single entity, a lot of times it seems like regulators' performance indicators rides on service providers' indicators. I think that is something that really need to be separated to ensure that whatever resources built in is not looking from output perspective, but from outcome. CWIS agenda designed based on outcome, but normally financing framework is always output. What kind of treatment plant being put in, how many toilets being deployed, how many septic tanks being deployed. So this is how output will look like. So I think there is a need to differentiate what are the performance indicators for the regulator who's held accountable to drive the sector. So I hope I actually responded to your question.
Thank you so much, Punita. I think you did very well in that very short space of time. Unfortunately, we have really hit the top of the hour, and we would have liked to continue this discussion a little bit more, but we will just have to wrap up at this point. Thank you so much to the panelists, to the presenters. In wrapping up, we have some calls to action. As we said earlier, sorry, there was somebody talking. As we said earlier, citywide inclusive sanitation will not be achieved until it is organized into public service and include informal settlements. This is talking about the poorest of the poor as well. They must be covered. So responsibilities should be integrated within one responsible authority where feasible. Clarification of public service mandate does not imply full public sector service provision. It means even the privates can participate. Accountability for non-sewage sanitation services and services for the poor merits special focus. Financing frameworks are key to prioritize public finance for inclusive service outcomes over infrastructure inputs. An investment in national system soft infrastructure must accompany financing for hard infrastructure. Next, so the publications are available on the CWIS website. These are the short form publications. As we said earlier at the beginning, more detailed publications will be released by the end of September. So please look out for these on the CWIS website, and we will also be doing an official launch of the long form papers. Thank you so much for having participated with us, and we look forward to engaging further through our websites, on Twitter, Facebook, you can still post questions that we'll be able to answer. Thank you for having been with us, and good day.